When the Roman statesman and philosopher Seneca wrote his letters nearly 2,000 years ago, he had no way of knowing that they would still be read, quoted, and wrestled with centuries later. Yet these letters have quietly influenced emperors, scholars, and modern thinkers who searched for guidance during moments of uncertainty. To this day, Letters from a Stoic continues to appear on the reading lists of people navigating pressure, ambition, anxiety, and success, not because it offers motivation in the modern sense, but because it offers something rarer, which is clarity under strain. At its core, this book addresses a problem that feels uniquely modern, but is actually timeless, which is the feeling of being overwhelmed by forces we cannot control while neglecting the inner life we still can shape. What Seneca promises, indirectly but powerfully, is a way to live with steadiness, dignity, and perspective even when circumstances are unstable. In this audio summary, you will learn how to reclaim control over your time, your reactions, and your values in a world that constantly pulls you outward. But before we dive deeper, let us first understand who Seneca was. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was not a monk secluded from society, nor was he a philosopher writing from a position of comfort and detachment, but rather a man deeply embedded in power, politics, and danger. Born in Spain and raised in Rome, Seneca rose to become one of the most influential figures of his time, serving as an advisor to Emperor Nero while simultaneously attempting to live according to Stoic principles that demanded restraint, virtue, and inner independence. This tension between philosophy and real life is what gives Letters from a Stoic its enduring force. The letters were written to Seneca's friend Lucilius, but they were never meant to be private in spirit. They read less like formal essays and more like thoughtful conversations, where Seneca reflects on fear, wealth, anger, friendship, death, and the constant pull of distraction. The core problem Seneca addresses is not ignorance, but misdirected attention, as people tend to invest their energy in external outcomes while neglecting the cultivation of character. What he offers instead is a practical philosophy designed to be lived daily, not admired from afar. And through these letters, Seneca invites the reader to slow down, examine their inner life, and live with deliberate intention. The foundational principle. The unifying principle that runs through Letters from a Stoic is the idea that true freedom comes from mastering one's inner world rather than attempting to dominate external circumstances. Seneca returns to this idea repeatedly, emphasizing that most human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the judgments, fears, and desires we attach to them. According to Stoic philosophy, life will always contain uncertainty, loss, and discomfort, but our experience of these realities depends largely on how we interpret and respond to them. Seneca argues that people mistakenly outsource their happiness to wealth, status, approval, or future outcomes, which places their peace of mind at the mercy of chance. Instead, he insists that a stable and meaningful life is built on virtues such as wisdom, self-control, courage, and justice, qualities that remain within our control regardless of circumstances. This does not mean withdrawing from life or suppressing emotion, but rather engaging fully while remaining internally grounded. Throughout the letters, Seneca frames philosophy not as abstract theory, but as mental training, designed to strengthen resilience, sharpen judgment, and reduce unnecessary suffering, making it as practical to this day as it was in ancient Rome. Key lessons and major themes. Theme 1. Time is your most precious resource. Seneca repeatedly reminds Lucilius that time, not money or possessions, is the only truly non-renewable resource, and yet it is the one people waste most carelessly. He observes that individuals fiercely protect their property, but allow their days to be consumed by distractions, obligations, and pursuits that offer little lasting value. According to Seneca, the tragedy is not that life is short, but that people live as if it will never end, postponing meaningful living until some imagined future. He argues that busyness often disguises emptiness, as people fill their schedules to avoid confronting deeper questions about purpose and values. The Stoic response to this condition is not to withdraw from responsibilities, but to become intentional about how time is spent, aligning daily actions with long-term principles rather than short-term impulses. To apply this lesson, begin by treating your time with the same seriousness you would treat a valuable asset. This means regularly asking whether your commitments reflect your priorities, and whether your daily habits contribute to a life you respect. Seneca encourages frequent reflection, not as self-criticism, but as course correction, allowing you to reclaim ownership of your days and live with greater presence and direction. Theme 2: Wealth, Comfort, and the Illusion of Security. Although Seneca himself was wealthy, he remained deeply skeptical of riches as a source of fulfillment. He argues that wealth often increases anxiety rather than reducing it, since the fear of loss grows in proportion to what one owns. According to Seneca, people confuse comfort with contentment, believing that external abundance will produce internal peace, yet they often find themselves restless even in luxury. Seneca does not condemn wealth outright, but he insists that it must remain a tool rather than a master. The danger arises when identity becomes entangled with possessions, making self-worth dependent on factors beyond one's control. For the Stoic, true security comes from wanting less rather than acquiring more, and from cultivating resilience rather than insulation from hardship. Applying this teaching involves practicing voluntary simplicity, not as deprivation, but as preparation. Seneca recommends periodically experiencing modest living conditions to remind oneself that happiness does not depend on excess. By reducing attachment to comfort and status, you build confidence in your ability to endure change, which paradoxically makes life feel more secure and less fragile. Theme 3: Emotional Discipline and the Management of Anger and Fear. One of the most practical aspects of Letters from a Stoic is Seneca's exploration of emotional regulation, particularly concerning anger, fear, and anxiety. Seneca views unchecked emotion as a form of slavery, where external events dictate inner states. He argues that emotions are not irrational forces imposed upon us, but responses shaped by beliefs, interpretations, and habits of thought. Anger, in particular, is described as a temporary madness that distorts judgment and damages relationships. Fear, similarly, often arises from imagined futures rather than present realities. Seneca urges readers to examine their emotional reactions carefully, recognizing the gap between stimulus and response as a space for choice. To apply this insight, practice delaying reaction, especially during moments of emotional intensity. Seneca advises pausing, examining the story you are telling yourself about the situation, and asking whether it aligns with reality. And over time, this habit weakens emotional impulsivity and strengthens self-command, allowing you to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Theme 4: Mortality as a Guide to Meaningful Living. Perhaps the most confronting yet liberating theme in Seneca's letters is his insistence on regularly contemplating death. Far from being morbid, this practice is intended to sharpen appreciation for life and strip away trivial concerns. Seneca argues that fear of death often underlies anxiety, ambition, and attachment, and that learning to accept mortality frees one to live more honestly and fully. By acknowledging the inevitability of death, Seneca encourages readers to focus on what truly matters, which includes character, relationships, and the use of time. Life, he suggests, should be measured by depth rather than duration. Applying this teaching means using mortality as a lens for decision-making. When faced with choices, ask whether the concern will matter in the context of a finite life. This perspective helps dissolve petty anxieties and redirects attention toward actions that contribute to long-term meaning and integrity. Synthesis and critique. Letters from a Stoic resonates strongly with modern audiences because it addresses psychological challenges that persist across centuries, including anxiety, distraction, and the pursuit of status. Many of Seneca's ideas align with contemporary cognitive psychology, particularly the emphasis on interpretation over circumstance, as well as Eastern traditions that emphasize detachment and mindfulness. However, the book is sometimes misunderstood as promoting emotional suppression or indifference, which is a misreading of Stoicism. Seneca does not advocate withdrawing from life or denying emotion, but rather cultivating proportion and perspective. Another common critique concerns Seneca's personal wealth, which some view as contradictory to his teachings. Yet this tension reinforces the book's central message, which is that philosophy is not about perfection but practice. The value of Seneca's letters lies not in presenting an idealized sage, but in offering a thoughtful, honest struggle toward wisdom, making the work both relatable and enduring. My takeaway from Letters from a Stoic. The single most valuable lesson from Seneca's letters is that a meaningful life is built from the inside out, through disciplined attention to values, time, and judgment. Seneca reminds us that while we cannot control the world, we can control how we meet it, and that this control is the foundation of freedom. As you reflect on these ideas, consider choosing one Stoic practice to experiment with this week. Whether it is guarding your time more carefully, questioning emotional reactions, or simplifying your desires. Small, consistent shifts in perspective can quietly transform how you experience daily life. If you found value in this exploration, consider engaging further by reflecting, sharing your insights, or returning to the text itself, because philosophy, as Seneca intended it, only comes alive when it is practiced.